So, one of the most famous events of the civil rights movement in the USA is undoubtedly the case of Linda Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, 1954. This is key. It's absolutely essential. You must understand this. But do not get caught up in the background to the Brown case. What is much more important is what the Supreme Court decided and the effects of that case, how effective it was and what it led to. That's really key. The most common mistake I see students make is telling me all about poor Linda Brown. It's not going to get you good results, good marks. So before we start the Brown case, it's really important that you understand some of the key terms that are going to be used quite often throughout this course. First of that is segregation. Now, segregation was basically a set of laws to separate African Americans from white Americans in certain US states. Not all US states had segregation laws. It was much more common in the South than in the North. But there were still certain parts of the northern cities and northern businesses that were segregated. Now, these segregation laws are also known as Jim Crow laws. And the states that had these segregation laws are also known as Jim Crow states. All right. Now, segregation essentially goes back to a legal case in 1896. It is essential. The examiner loves it if you pepper your answer with this kind of stuff. 1896, the case of Plessy, P-L-E-S-S-Y, versus Ferguson. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Essentially, it was a case that said segregation, keeping the races separate, is okay, it's constitutional, as long as things are separate but equal. And that's the exact wording of it, separate but equal. Now, whilst facilities were separate, cinemas, restaurants, swimming pools, parks, water fountains, transport, they absolutely were not equal in terms of quality. Okay? Now, so the 1950s, after many African Americans had become more politically motivated and wanted to end segregation and discrimination in many parts of the US. In the 1950s, there were a lot of challenges to segregation. And the two main areas, there are others, the two main ones that we tend to focus on are challenges in terms of education and challenges in transport. Okay? So, in terms of education, the first challenge, the key challenge is 1954, the challenge to segregation in Topeka, Kansas. T-O-P-E-K-A, Topeka, Kansas, which is a Midwest state. Now, essentially, it was a challenge by the parents of a young African-American girl called Linda Brown. They wanted her to attend a local, closer school in their town of Topeka, or in their state, I forget what the Americans call it now, their area of Topeka. They wanted their daughter Linda to attend the local school much closer than the segregated African-American school. And so what they did was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, their lawyers, led by Thurgood Marshall, took Linda Brown's case to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the US. Its decision is utterly final. No one can criticize or challenge the Supreme Court's decision. Okay? Now, so they took it to the Supreme Court, and their argument was that segregated education lowered the self-esteem of the students involved in it, and it also lowered their educational achievement levels. And they put forward a very, very, very persuasive case. Now, it took 18 months for the Supreme Court to reach a decision, and the Supreme Court was led by a man called Chief Justice Earl Warren, W-A-R-R-E-N. Okay. And 18 months later, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, reached its decision, and it said that segregation education was unconstitutional and illegal. Its exact wording, a lovely little quote for you to learn, is that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. It's not fair. It's not separate but equal, it's inherently unequal. Therefore, it's unconstitutional, which is an amazing result. Amazing result for the civil rights movement. It set a legal precedent, a first case, a first challenge to segregation. However, you must be aware of the problems of the Brown versus the Board of Education Topeka decision. The first one is, when Chief Justice Earl Warren said it's unconstitutional, he never set a timeline for segregation in education to end. He didn't say it needs to be totally desegregated in 6 months. He just said at the earliest possible speed. Now, everyone has very different interpretations of what the earliest possible speed is. My students often think that trying to get their homework in as early as possible takes a week. My definition is slightly different, okay? If you don't set a specific timeline, it gives people an excuse to not do it. So, by 1957, 300,000 African Americans were in desegregated schools. Tick, result. Brilliant. But as a historian, we also show balance, and we say, however, whilst there were 300,000 African Americans in segregated schools, there were still 2.4 million African Americans in Jim Crow schools or segregated schools. So, not quite ended segregation there. Now, second thing is, some southern states tried very, very, very hard to do everything in their power to avoid desegregating schools. Between 1954 and 1956, southern states passed between them 450 laws to prevent the Supreme Court decision being implemented or put in place. 450 laws to stop Brown. Yeah. Third thing is the white reaction, the reaction of white Americans. Now, the first of the reactions is the re-emergence of a group called the Ku Klux Klan. K-U, new word, K-L-U-X, new word, K-L-A-N. It's a white supremacist racist group. They're the guys in the hooded hats and the burning crosses. And enough said. The massive emergence of those guys. Now, in addition to that, slightly less extreme than the Ku Klux Klan, you had the White Citizens Councils. And these were groups of local people who joined together to try and keep or protect segregation in their town or state, okay, or area. Now, the third thing that white citizens did was there was a thing called the Southern Manifesto signed, and it was over 100 Southern politicians from the House of Representatives and the Congress and Senate, 100 Southern politicians all wrote in this and said that we oppose integration. So while the Supreme Court said end it, there's a massive, massive movement by the white Americans to try and prevent desegregation happening. Now, it's key to remember that the Brown decision was a legal victory. A precedent was set. But the key thing to remember is laws are easy to change. Attitudes are much more difficult. And it takes a great deal longer to change attitudes than it does laws. And that was the problem in some of these southern states. Not all white Americans, by the way, just some of them there. For example, in 1956, at the University of Alabama, the first African-American student enrolled, and she's female, and the NAACP had kind of made the government enforce a court case which had said they have to accept this girl. When she turned up at the university, there was huge riots by the white students, and the university officials said, no, you need to go. And they made her go, and they forbade her from ever coming back, even though Brown had said they have the legal right. At the University of Alabama, that was not happening. And in fact, it wasn't until 1963 that the first African-American student attended the University of Alabama. Key thing here, a legal precedent had been set, but it was largely ignored by the Jim Crow states, okay, because there was no timetable for it to be implemented. Now, it's not until 1957 that somebody makes the Brown decision be enforced. And that person is President Eisenhower at Little Rock High School, which is the second of the two case studies for civil rights and education. All right, I hope that makes sense to you.